So one big question is, where are the boundaries? Where are the boundaries between online and offline? Where are the boundaries between one community and another community? And where, I guess, is, broadly speaking, is the field? Where is the field of virtual ethnography? Where is it that the researcher needs to locate him or herself? And how can they best do that? I think another big issue, big debate around this is around the ethics of virtual ethnography, which was reflected in a lot of the conversation today around people trying to figure out actually how you can do this kind of work in a way that respects the people involved, respects the communities, but still gets at what's really important in these kinds of spaces, which can often be needing the researcher to spend a long time in these kinds of spaces, or spend particular kinds of time where they're really becoming participants in that space. And how do you preserve the sense of yourself as a researcher for other people and yourself while still getting really engaged and involved? And that's a question that ethnographers have had to deal with all the time since the beginning of ethnography, but it's still really a live issue, particularly where people move in and out of their field sites more seamlessly than would have been the case in the past, and that is something else that virtual ethnography brings to the fore. This bit of a presentation is really just to touch on some of the issues, some of the big questions that virtual ethnography in particular raises, not only about its own practices, but about generally about practices of ethnography. This image that you're seeing now is from an artist called Pushpamala N, who's Bangalore-based performance artist. And she has done a lot of work in a particularly interesting way around problematizing some of the sort of stories about ethnography and what ethnography is and does. And that, I think, is a kind of an indication of the ways in which traditional forms of ethnography are being brought in and also challenged in some of the newer practices that are emerging at the moment. And we'll talk about how that impacts on the digital and digital ways of doing research as well. So, a general definition of what ethnography is. Participant observation is the primary approach to data collection in ethnography. The researcher immerses herself in a culture sharing group and becomes a participant within the setting. Sounds straightforward enough. Christine Hine, who wrote one of the classic books about virtual ethnography called Virtual Ethnography, says that the sustained presence of an ethnographer in the field setting, combined with their intensive engagement with the everyday life of the inhabitants of the field site, makes for the special kind of knowledge that we call ethnographic. And you probably will have seen this Far Side cartoon before, already starting to question some of those standard assumptions about ethnography and what it's capable of doing and what it perhaps isn't capable of doing. Virtual ethnography, as Hine defines it, is an approach to ethnography which is almost but not quite like the real thing, which is, I think, a way of saying that we are always trying to approach that kind of ideal of what ethnography is supposed to be and to do, but we're never quite going to get there because our practices, our spaces and places kind of get in the way of that kind of pure ethnography, and that's how it should be, and that's what makes it so exciting. And a word on definitions and terminology. We like virtual ethnography, but other terms that are sort of similar and related, netnography, which tends to be used in a marketing context to work out what consumer behavior is in an online space. Digital ethnography, which is more referring to the use of digital tools and technologies to support ethnographic practices wherever they are and whatever they're about. Cyborg anthropology is kind of emergent at the moment, and it is mainly focused on the ways in which tools and technology are changing us and our communities. So again, it doesn't necessarily have to be internet related, but more technology more generally. And visual ethnography and virtual ethnography, I think probably because the words are similar, are often kind of treated together, but a visual ethnography would more specifically focus on the place of image, whether in a digital setting or a face-to-face kind of space. And maybe, possibly, we could probably drop the virtual now and just talk about ethnography, because we just have so many examples of community situations where there's really no such thing as offline. Offline and online are sort of interpenetrating in ways that make the idea of virtual ethnography probably, maybe not now, but maybe quite soon, not really a very informative term. So ethnography as a kind of flexible practice is a useful way of thinking about virtual ethnography. We can ask questions in a virtual ethnographic context about where's the field, what actually community is, how does it play out in virtual online spaces, what counts as participation and immersion for the researcher but also for other participants, and where is that boundary between the offline and the online, is it an important boundary to preserve, or is it something we should be challenging in our research practices? I'll show you a little bit of a recent...
Here's an idea. There's no such thing as offline. Okay, before you get all riled up, we're not going to talk about how the internet doesn't exist, because here it is, in your face.
I'm in your face.
We are going to talk about our relationship to it, though, and how that relationship is confusing. Sort of like the relationship between Dr. Pepper and Mr. Pibb. Are they work associates? Cousins? Lovers? Our relationship to the internet is confusing because we use all of these action verbs and location words. You visit websites, you surf, and you bookmark things. We talk about the deep web like it has a size, and we talk about the dark web like it has shadowy bits. In fact, this is how we talk about computers in general. We have mice, which are not actually small animals, and desktops, which are not actually the top of a desk, and all of these other things that are so second nature, their metaphoric base has totally eroded. The ways that we talk about our computers and the internet have this residue of the past. Like when the technology which would eventually become the internet was first strung together in the 1950s, it was a closed network of machines working together. Computers connected to the network were said to be online. They were part of the process. But as the internet grew to a nearly ungrokkable spaghetti mountain of worldwide connections, anything and everything connected, connectable, accessible, and verifiable through the internet, its ubiquity and complexity invites the question, is someone or something ever not online? I don't mean to suggest we're always using the internet. There are plenty of situations where that would be inappropriate or downright dangerous. But more like, do you have to be using the internet to be online? And if you're in the middle of the woods, are you offline? If you're looking at Twitter on your phone or playing Halo multiplayer, then of course you're online. But are you online if you're sending a text message? Or what if you're being forced to watch this video in a classroom? Sorry. What if you have a Tumblr with an auto-posting queue or a Wikipedia entry? What if, while away from your computer, you think to yourself, that would make a great animated GIF? Are you online if you keep your money in a bank or have a driver's license? I would say yes to all of these, but especially the animated GIF one. I think that all the time. Even media which are not...
So in your reference list is the full link to that video if you want to watch the rest of it. I do recommend it. It's quite a good one. I'm going to hand over to Jeremy to talk about Daniel Miller's work called Tales from Facebook.
Yeah, I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about Tales from Facebook, written by Daniel Miller, a very well-known anthropologist, really one of the pioneers of kind of trying to do digital ethnography. He's a fantastic speaker, so what if you've ever heard him speak, you'll know what I mean. So what I'll actually do is let him introduce his own book for a moment. I've had the pleasure on a couple of occasions, so I do recommend if you get a chance to hear what he has to say, and then I'll say a little bit more about
the first question is that we do not know what Facebook is. That Facebook is something that is going to be created by the people we're working with. So we want to find out, what are they made of this? What turns out to be Facebook in terms of what they post, how they actually banter, how they make it something that is particular to themselves. Secondly, of course, anthropologists are interested in social relations. The very term social network is almost the way anthropologists understand people. We never see people just as individuals. For us, a person is always a mother's brother, an employee to an employer, a best friend or a less good friend. They're always in relation to others. And social network sites like Facebook obviously a wonderful sort of guide to actually see how those social relationships are developing today.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I'll just pause it there. So what I think is interesting about this book, what is really interesting is how it deals with this question of what is online and what is offline, and it tries to challenge that distinction between the kind of real, authentic community and the virtual community. It's dealing, in some of his other work, he deals with Trinidad, which is a Caribbean island. So we have this idea of a kind of authentic small island community. And what's really interesting about this book is he brings the idea of studying Facebook in Trinidad. So we're challenging this idea of the superficial online social network community happening in what is supposed to be, in common understanding, a kind of authentic, small-scale island community. So really authenticity, I think, is one of the main interesting themes in this book. where is the authentic field site of this ethnography? And what Daniel Miller what he said in some of his previous work, and what he's really trying to get across in this work, is that things like the internet, and in this case Facebook, do not exist apart from the relations and the specific contexts and the relationships between people who make Facebook. So for him, Facebook, the centre of his Facebook world in this study is Facebook in Trinidad. It's neither the island community or the social network. And of course, authenticity also extends to his discussion of how people use it. So there is this commonplace idea that social networks are somehow superficial, but he tries to challenge that argument as well. And he tries to show in a number of case studies how real identity is formed, what people perceive to be authentic identity is formed in social network sites such as Facebook. And of course, it's because of the issues about privacy and about being public that authenticity is kind of made more real for those people who are using Facebook. Because they're in public, because they're constructing identities that can be seen by everybody else, that gives them a sense of authentic identity.
So Christine Hine, in another of the papers that's referenced in your reference list, wrote a follow-up paper to her book about virtual ethnography, which is called Virtual Ethnography Revisited, and she defines virtual ethnography using these kind of 10 key sort of ideas or points. You can find that paper online, so I won't read out all of these, but basically the questions about boundaries, the virtual and the real in particular, should not be taken for granted. Intensive engagement with mediated interaction adds an important reflexive dimension to ethnography, and I think in part that's about the idea of participant observation. So what Hine is saying, what she's arguing basically, is that what's interesting about a virtual ethnographic field, if you can define what the field is that anybody can go there. It's not like, when you used to have to travel for thousands of miles and go to some remote place that nobody had ever been before. So the authority of the ethnographer may potentially look like it's being challenged in a virtual ethnographic practice, because if anyone can go and look and see the same stuff that you've seen, what makes you a researcher and them, not a researcher? And I think that's a really good question, but also what Hine is basically saying is that whether you travel or you don't travel, the relationship between the ethnographer, the reader, and the research subjects is still inscribed in the ethnographic text, and the ethnographer is still uniquely placed to give an account of the field site based on their experience of it and their interaction with it. So all is not lost. The notion of participant observation, however, does get pretty complex pretty quickly, as in all ethnographic situations, but particularly in a kind of online setting. So this example is a paper from way back in 2004 about a couple of researchers who were working on Buffy the Vampire Slayer discussion boards in a place called the Bronze, which was the official discussion space for Buffy. If anybody else besides me is a Buffy fan, you may remember this. And their paper is really interesting in as much as it talks a lot about actually not only the mechanics of how they got into that field site and what they did when they were there, but actually the complications that are involved in being both a fan and an ethnographer, for example. So they both talk about having been fans of the show before they even decided they were going to study this particular environment. They say that both of them started from a position of stumbling onto a communication forum while surfing the net looking for information about the show. By the time they actually met each other and decided to be systematic about their participation, they were already independently accepted members of the community. They had each generated a base of trust in their insights. So what they did was, between 1998 and 2002, they spent a lot of time on the discussion forum, but also in associated instant messaging chat, emails, real-time chat, and also they participated in some face-to-face gatherings that were held by members of this community. And as they continued to do their work, they also sort of recruited and were kind of asked by other members of the community if they could act as junior sociologists and keep their own field notes within the space of the discussion forum, which I think leads to the very good question, is anyone here a real sheep? I think that this question about participant observation becomes highlighted in an ethnographic setting, and maybe this would be something that would be good for us to talk more about later on. Another kind of really interesting puzzle issue question around participant observation comes from the work of T.L. Taylor, who has done work over the last 10 years or more particularly in massively multiplayer online role-playing games, which are these gigantic games where people are playing like World of Warcraft, where people are playing together online. And she makes the very good point that actually in a space like that, if you want to study that space, you have to play, and not only do you have to play, you have to be good if you want to follow, groups that are extremely advanced and see how community works in those big groups, which she did. You can't kind of come in and just kind of watch, because you'll get killed in 2 seconds and you won't get to see anything that happens. TL was here last year, and she gave a really good talk as part of the Digital Humanities and Social Sciences Day of Ideas, and she showed a little clip, and I'll see if I can get to it.
Okay, come on.
Of
We're
what
5 years old. But these folks come together, raiders.
what it looks like in these kinds of spaces, and why you might need to be good to get into them.
And they put together this movie to show others what they were accomplishing in the game. And I think it's one of these really nice examples. The language is a little rough, but I think it'll give you some sense for what these spaces look like inside. So let me play a snippet for you.
TL's playing a snippet, and I'm playing a snippet of TL. It's all very meta.
This is at a time when people were 40 people together in one space playing.
So that's the voice, that's the microphones we're hearing, right?
Yeah,
The sound.
that's
and then
right.
Is that the chat? Is that the
It could be, or they could be on Skype at the same time. That sometimes happens where the voice in the game isn't so good. So that video itself goes on for several minutes, and TL doesn't show the whole thing, but she talks about what it can mean to try to be an ethnographer in spaces that kind of are designed to make you feel something. So the kind of, she talks about the unruly and unpredictable nature of doing some kinds of ethnographic research that are laden with emotion and negotiated via the body. And in a talk I was at, I took the second thing. It's not a direct quote from her, but she said, our presence shapes what we find in the ethnographic field, and we are transformed, and we transform those communities, and our stories linger on. Ethnography is deeply transformative work. And I think that I'd be really interested to hear from you guys about your own experiences of whether or not that's been the case, or whether you expect it to be the case in the work that you're going to do. And just to say one more thing about this idea of participant observation, in a project that Jeremy and I both worked on a few years ago, we asked students to be, and Jeremy at that time was a student on the MSc in e-learning program, we asked students to be ethnographers in their own courses and to take field notes of their experiences of assessment and feedback and those kinds of things in their courses. And we of course told all of the students who were taking the courses that this was going to be happening and who the ethnographers were, and that led to a sort of interesting problem for the students who were the ethnographers, because they were in the position where people thought that they were asking questions and doing things because they were trying to get ethnographic data, when in fact, as one of them says, I was truly trying to find out what everyone was up to, because I needed to know, because as a student I was confused and I didn't know what was happening. But that she felt like a spy or like a double agent being in this space and trying to do more than one thing at a time. And that, I think, was something we kind of knew would happen and were sort of prepared for, but of course you're not really prepared until you're there and experiencing it. And I think it was an interesting experience for those students. I think one of the most interesting questions about virtual ethnography is where is this happening? Does it matter, for example, as T.L. Taylor often asks, whether the people that you meet online are telling the truth about themselves? What is the truth about themselves that they would or wouldn't be telling you, and does it matter? And I think for some projects it does matter, and for some it doesn't, and it sort of depends what you're trying to find out. But it's one of the first questions really to try to ask is like, what, you know, if somebody says there's something in the online environment, is it important to you to know whether that's verifiable in kind of demographic terms or whatever? And it's such a kind of interesting question. And also the other thing is about the location of the field site and the fact that in virtual ethnography, flow and connectivity kind of replace the idea of location and boundary. Even if you're in what seems like quite a kind of finite community space, you'll usually find people linking off to something else. And I think this question of, you know, how far do you need to go, how many links, how many levels deep do you have to go in order to get what you need from the field site is pretty important one to consider early on as well. This example is from an American researcher called Mer Domingo, who did a project looking at literacy practices of a bunch of what were called Pinoys, Filipino rappers, a community of rappers based all over the world, but she came and did her fieldwork in the UK and was following a group of 6 of this community of young people who were making music and kind of exploring their cultural heritage together. And I'll show you a little bit of one of the videos of one of the participants in her project, a guy called Asiatic. Well, it's his name online anyway. And I'm sorry if anyone speaks Tagalog because this might be rude. I'm not really sure. I'm assuming not.
Yo, Asiatic, Lyrico Supremo, Third Eye Productions. Sa lahat ng mga movement sa UK, big up. Yoga Fire, KYD, ISC, lahat ng SBL crew. Make some noise. Hip-hop, lalong lumalakas ang puwersa. Di ko na kailangang itulak pa o ipuwersa. Aking mga verse na lagi nang impress ka. Flow ko ay maagos parang dumudugong puwerta. Laging nakakinta, ready pang puminta.
So Domingo's project was about trying to find out what the literacy practices of these young people were and how they did or didn't actually were or weren't recognized in the kind of classroom settings where they were perhaps sometimes being seen as kind of not good readers and writers, not good users of language. So she followed them around for a year or something and looked at how their literacy practices were being demonstrated through the online environment and with each other and in their videos that they were making. So she was exploring how what she's calling linguistic layering was used to just by the young people to cultivate their language identities, their cultural and language identities. And she had to do some kind of interesting things methodologically in order to try to capture what was going on in these spaces. So she was talking about how the Pinoys were constantly moving across digital and physical spaces, and so it was problematic to study their everyday literacy practices as rooted only in place-based structures. So she needed to display the ways in which they were actively layering their language as an art form across discourses. She's called this a migratory approach to ethnography, and I think that's quite a useful term for it. So she says that she collected data through both online and offline interactions, including interviews and observations and all kinds of things. And she collected literacy artifacts that were noisy and moving, like the video that you just saw. So she had to develop spatial and temporal reading paths that she could use to visually display these layering functions. And this is one example of her multimodal transcription practice. So each of these colors represents a different kind of mode. So there's the landscape, gesture, the written language, spoken language, visual effects, sound effect, and color. And so for each clip of the video, so from there you can see, I think that's 26 seconds to 27 seconds or something. These are the things that are going on in the video at this time under all of these different categories. And I think she had to kind of develop her own sort of space for keeping these field notes as well and doing this multimodal transcription because it didn't already exist, so she kind of had to invent it. And I think virtual ethnographers often find themselves in that situation where they have to kind of hack some existing tool to make it work for the environment that they're using and try to capture things and archive things and all kinds of stuff. It's complicated.
Yeah, I want to talk about networks of outrage and hope very briefly, which is, I think, one of the main texts to come out of what was termed the kind of year of protest last year, 2011. Castells is well known for his kind of writing on networks and about social movements as well. So for me, this book really goes back to this question of where, because it's a book that tries to. There's not much about ethnography in here, but what he's essentially doing is studying social movements. So these are groups which. On one. These are groups which necessarily need to do things in real spaces. And if you know anything about the kind of movements that happened in 2011, we're talking about the Egyptian revolution, we're talking about Occupy, we're talking about Indignadas in Spain. We're talking about movements which their main thing was to occupy urban space. So what really interestingly what Castell proposes in this book is a new kind of social movement for the 21st century, and he proposes that by talking about movements as occupying spaces that are both digital and virtual and that interact between the two. So when he's describing these movements, he's describing how they start perhaps with social media. If we're talking about, for example, the Egyptian revolution, it started with a video blog. That was the kind of incendiary device which sent people to a real location, Tahrir Square in Cairo, and then other social media spaces were interacting with these real spaces in the city. And that's what he really begins to talk about rhizomatic revolution. So this idea that social media allows a more kind of horizontal mode of communication in order for these clusterings of people to form in city spaces. So an interesting kind of spatial theory brought to social movements. For me, what's really interesting, however, is about this relationship between doing ethnography and doing ethnography on something. Because what we have here is a book by one person, supposedly about a social movement which is horizontal, that isn't hierarchical, that can spring up and cluster in different places. But what we have is a centralized text by a very famous, well-known ethnographer, essentially summing up and representing this movement. So that is perhaps something interesting to think about in terms of what we have to do is write and represent these things that we're doing ethnography on. Certainly I have to.
Of particular interest to us, and I think probably generally of particular interest in relation to virtual ethnography, is the question of ethics. And as Beaulieu and Astalella point out, there has been a lot of conversation over the last 10 years. This is a Facebook friend wheel, by the way, that shows all the connections between different people in someone's Facebook network. This question about whether we're talking about texts or about people has been ongoing for quite a while. I don't think anybody's resolved it, so it's still a good one to talk about. This is the issue that, these kind of common spatial models of the internet and the conflation of the body with data have to be looked at more closely, because this dominant construction of the internet as a place where human subjects act, which is underpinned by the way that ethical approval processes work in most universities, that require us to think about our participants and as human subjects and to consider it from that point of view. And I'm not disputing that is an important thing to do, but it might lose us something about actually what makes the internet a different sort of space from face-to-face spaces, and how we might want to look at it in a slightly different way. And Bassett and Reardon have argued that a hybrid model of relational ethics that incorporates text, space, and bodies needs to be applied to internet research. So good luck with that then. And the paper that we sent round raises these two issues about contiguity and about traceability. And these, the authors are arguing, are the kind of important and less well discussed issues around the ethics of doing ethnographic work online. So this kind of dissolving of boundaries between the field and home complicates situations for the researcher themselves, and making clear boundaries between personal and professional spaces becomes more difficult. Leaving the field can't be understood anymore as a trip back home, but as a process of breaking with the routines and practices of field work. And for different people, that's probably challenging in different sorts of ways. geographical and temporal distinctions between the field, at home or away, as the locus and time for producing data, and academia as the locus and time for producing and disseminating knowledge blur to a greater extent when doing networked mediated ethnographies. And some of the examples in that paper I think are quite telling in relation to, for example, how Estalella decided to do his field work and make his kind of presence as a blogger known very widely within the community that he was interested in studying. But the effect of that was that all kinds of boundary crossings were happening, if you think of it as a boundary between the field work that he was trying to do, the stuff he was trying to observe, and the ways that his identity as a researcher, as an ethnographer, was being kind of performed in that space for other academics, for the people he was studying, and it's pretty interesting. And the second issue around traceability, so this question about whether we can actually offer anonymity to our research participants in the same way that we could have felt fairly confident that we could in the past. If we can't, what does that mean for our ethical, our formal ethics applications, but also what does it mean for our research? These sorts of questions about, finding data that's, if you quote something directly from the internet, someone's going to be able to find it and trace it back to find out who said it and where it was said. Do we have an obligation to talk to our participants about that possibility, and what should we say? And I think that, as they point out, we don't really have answers to these questions yet because of the way that ethical discussions around internet research are sometimes framed. So those are the sorts of kind of big ethical questions and issues that they suggest that we talk about, and there may be others that people want to raise as well when we get into discussion. So, one more example from Jeremy.
Yeah, I wanted to talk briefly about my PhD research. I'm still a PhD student at the School of Education here at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm currently engaged in researching massive open online courses, which you may have come across. Edinburgh's in a fairly prominent position with respect to these MOOCs, which are currently being offered in higher education. They're free online courses that attract very high enrollment numbers. So we're talking thousands of students on a single course. They're available and delivered entirely online, and they're in most cases free to enroll and free to participate. I want to take us right back to when we heard Daniel Miller talking about the goal of the anthropologist was to look at people and to look at relationships between people. So that's the kind of ethnographic thing that I'm interested in with this research, and I'm actually interested in broadening that view and thinking about the non-human. So my research is underpinned by a number of theories which try and contend with things that are outside of the social and outside of the human. So when we're dealing, what I think is very important when we're dealing with research that is online, we're dealing with technology, we're dealing with the digital, we're dealing with software, we're dealing with code, we're dealing with algorithms, and it may be that these non-human things are enmeshed with what we normally think of as the social and as the human. So that's the kind of research that I'm interested in. So, for example, I'll just leave it there. This image is from the University of Pennsylvania's course page on Coursera, which is one of these organizations which deliver the massive open online courses. And we can see here a wonderful image of the very old, antiquated, traditional campus building. So that's one of the things I'm interested in is spatially how the traditions of the university and the campus, these material buildings, are being transported into the online domain, and how that affect the ways that MOOCs are promoted. But even more so the kind of thing I'm talking about are spaces of perhaps inequality there.
This is the Kelly Reiner's house right here. We're here and we want to show
what this video is, which I can hopefully have time to show maybe in about a minute of, is one of the initial videos on a MOOC course. And this is Al Phil Rice. He's a professor at University of Pennsylvania, and what he taught was a course on American poetry. And if I show you a few seconds of this, this is one of the introductory videos from a MOOC.
Follow me. Let's give it a look. We have a beautiful garden here. We love our garden, and the pathway in the garden. Here it is. I don't know if you can see that, but The Quality of Heaven by William Carlos Williams. This is a poem that's etched in the garden as we go all the way through from the front to the back of the garden. You get to follow a William Carlos Williams poem about gardens. Then we have a front porch where a lot of people hang out pretty fairly often.
Okay, so what he's doing here is he's introducing everybody on this MOOC who could be from any part of the world. He's introducing them to a specific building, and it's the campus building where he normally teaches. So we've got this promotion of the privileged, the leafy Ivy League institution being promoted, and as access to that is being promoted. So what I'm interested in is those spatial metaphors moving online. But not only that, I'm interested in the agency of what we might term the non-social or the non-human. And one of the really interesting ways that at the moment I'm thinking this manifests in terms of space is things like YouTube. This is the very same video, and we have it embedded in YouTube. This is the way that lots of students will view it. But spatially, it's also organized and ordered by other, what YouTube called recommended videos. So spatially, this video, this introduction to the Ivy League campus is being ordered around something which is actually, I would argue, a kind of enmeshed human and non-human agency. What we've got here are algorithms working out what other videos appear here and what other videos are associated with this space. Recommended videos work by algorithms. They also take into account the other YouTube users who have also watched this video and the other videos that they link to after watching this video. So we have a complex, what I think is a complex mix of human and non-human going on in this space.
And I guess that for me, this kind of introduces a whole other layer to ethnographic research that makes us, it kind of asks us, I guess, it doesn't force us to, but it asks us to pay attention to the virtual spaces in which this community is playing out, and to consider how the spaces themselves are actually creating that community, impacting on that community, and whether the community has control over those spaces or not, because often you don't. You know, you choose a space to do some work in and it has its own things going on within it, and those are not those are contributing to community just as much as the people who are there, I would argue, and I think Jeremy would argue that as well. So just one more thing to think about, and then we have some time to have a bit of a conversation and maybe make some introductions as well. This is from a book by Kozinets, who writes about netnography. This is, he says, the way that technology and, actually I think it's they, and culture interact is a complex dance, and interweaving and intertwining. This element of technocultural change is present in our public spaces, our workplaces, our homes, our relationships, and our bodies, each institutional element intermixed with every other one. Technology constantly shapes and reshapes our bodies, our places, and our identities, and is shaped to our needs as well. Understanding of the way this transformation unfolds requires us to keep a keen eye on particular and general contexts, specific times and places, distinctive rules or rational procedures, institutional histories, technical possibilities, practical and popular uses, fears and dreams. A thorough understanding of these contexts requires ethnography. Thanks.
As some of the content that we use today made clear, is it's very difficult to think of ourselves as not online these days. Mm-hmm. So in some senses, calling something virtual ethnography doesn't really quite get at the issue. What we're talking about is ethnography, because so much of the things that we study nowadays have some kind of online element and are somehow involved in digital systems in some way.
Yeah. It's figuring out how to create contact with people in an online environment. So I don't think that the most exciting things about online digital education are about how to kind of present more information more quickly or more efficiently. I think it's about how do we extend our understanding of what it means to be with people in a kind of learning and teaching context. So things that explore ways in which people can be together online in perhaps ways that are different and maybe impossible in a face-to-face setting, I think are particularly interesting and exciting. And we're at a lucky time in education more generally where there's just so much great interesting technology and interesting platforms coming up that are making those kinds of connections more possible.